Pop Goes the 60s continues with part 3 of the Beach Boys. We left off in part 2 with the disappointing reception of the single The Little Girl I Once Knew, which only reached number 20 in Billboard and completely missed the charts in the UK despite a very glowing review by John Lennon. The single was far from a catastrophe, as it essentially was a springboard for the next album and the sound that Brian wanted to create. He wanted to create a special sound and spread that across an entire LP. And as mentioned in the preceding video, Brian's use of drugs started to enhance the way he approached music, and in many ways it helped him create more on a different level. But the problem was that the drugs came in between his family and his band. Brian's wife Marilyn thought that the drugs medicated his pain, and after a month-long separation from Brian, Marilyn returned to him and they moved into their New Beverly Hills home in October of 1965. Inspired by the US version of the Beatles' Rubber Soul, Brian now had something to shoot for, and that was to make the greatest rock album ever made. Before he could really get started on the album, he had some damage control to do because their late 1965 album, The Beach Boys' Party, was recorded as kind of a Christmas quickie, and Brian had to explain a little bit of this to the reporters by saying, "It's not a produced record and should not be considered indicative of the group's upcoming music." So he was already setting the stage for what was to come next. Brian added another new element to the mix, and that was Tony Asher as a lyricist, who he met through his friend Lauren Schwartz. Now, up till now, Brian's main collaborator, lyrically anyway, was Mike Love. And this new sound that Brian was working on, Mike Love, it was a departure for him and for the band. And Mike always was more into the danceable songs and those type of upbeat songs, and this album was going to be a lot more subdued. And for that, Brian wanted to bring in a lyricist that could match his feelings about the album. And Mike was a little uneasy about this, but Brian assured him, "Hey Mike, this will only be for one album." Mike agreed, and according to Brian, they shook on it. Tony Asher was somewhat of an unlikely pick for a lyricist. He had mainly been a jingle writer for Mattel, and you would probably know at least one of his slogans.
You'll find Chatty Cathy and her costume sets wherever toys are sold.
You can tell it's Mattel, it's swell.
He was basically a Hollywood brat, the son of silent film star Laura LaPlante and film producer Irving Asher. Originally called Our Freaky Friends, the album began in earnest in early 1966. Now, in addition to adding Tony Asher as lyricist, Brian Wilson also employed a much larger pool of studio musicians to capture the sound to match the grandeur of the lyrics. And some of the tracks have been recorded while the group was touring in Japan. When the band heard these new recordings, there was some genuine concern over them, and Al said that the whole group was dismayed at this new direction. Mike Love was concerned about how they would reproduce it on stage, since a lot of the music wasn't really your standard guitar, bass, and drums. And Carl, meanwhile, said that they just loved the record and loved making it. And I think once they got into it, they really started to appreciate the direction. Here's what Tony Asher said. He said, "All the guys in the band, certainly Al, Dennis, and Mike, were saying, this is not really Beach Boys material." And then Brian would basically goad them and chide them and say, "You guys can't hack this. You guys aren't good enough." And then the guys would sing and really give it their all. Carl, who usually played guitar alongside the studio musicians, said this. He said, "It really wasn't appropriate for us to play on those Pet Sound songs. The tracking just got beyond us." The heavy use of studio musicians on this album was a departure for the band, and they did voice their concerns to Brian about it. But Brian was determined, and work on the album proceeded following Brian's plan. So for the album cover, they went to the San Diego Zoo, and it was reported in the San Diego Union that the title was going to be Our Freaky Friends. And as you can see, I guess these goats are the freaky friends. But by the time the album came out, it was called Pet Sounds, and this was an idea that came from Mike Love. One of the things you may notice is that Bruce Johnston is not featured on this album cover, and this is the third album cover in a row where he's not featured, and that was due to a contractual agreement. Now, 2 months before the album was released, they put out the lead single called Caroline No, but this was actually not billed as the Beach Boys, but as a Brian Wilson solo single.
Happy glow, oh Caroline, no.
Caroline No is a great song, and it's one of my all-time favorites by the Beach Boys. And I don't know who was whispering in Brian's ear and suggesting that he go solo or this be billed as a solo record, because this song only charted at number 32. So it was a bit of a stiff coming out the gates. Probably not the best way to lead what was supposed to be the greatest rock album of all time. And not only did it chart lowly in the United States at 32, but it did even chart in the UK. Capitol quickly released another single that was probably the most commercial song on the album.
Come on this loop, John B. My grandfather and me.
Sloop John B was a song that Al Jardine really liked, and Brian Wilson was a big fan too, and he really did a nice job arranging it. And this restored the Beach Boys to the top 10 in both the US and the UK.
I try hard to be more what you want me to be. It starts with just a little glance now. Right away you're thinking about romance. I guess I just wasn't made for these times. But don't put your head on my shoulder.
Clearly, these four songs show an advancement in the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson's writing at the time, and you hear bits of classical and exotica in here. And Tony Asher's lyrics really bring out the despair and the disillusionment in Brian Wilson's compositions. Despite this advancement, Al Jardine said, "I wasn't exactly thrilled with the change in music style, but I grew to really appreciate it as soon as we started to work on it. It took us quite a while to adjust to the new material because it wasn't music you could necessarily dance to." Mike Love had stated, "We worked and worked on the harmonies, and if there was the slightest little hint of a sharp or a flat, it wouldn't go on. We would have to do it over again until it was right. And then he might, the next day, completely throw that out, and we might have to do it all over again." So this is where Mike Love called Brian the Stalin of the studio. So Wilson was really starting to work these guys because he was going for a particular sound and a very delicate sound, and the voices had to be just right. Now, the Beach Boys used over 55 different session musicians to complete this album, and that made the album feel really sophisticated and ethereal in places. What also gave this a big sound was the leakage from the microphones in this orchestral setting in this big studio with all these players. The other microphones were picking up on this and making the sound much bigger. As Brian commented on the sound as being an interpretation of Phil Spector's wall of sound production technique. These songs take production well past what Phil Spector was doing, and Brian Wilson was always kind of deferring to Spector and really looked up to him. But I mean, Brian Wilson was surpassing him by this point easily, and Spector was just going into a dry period. When I first heard this album, I was about 14 or 15 when I bought it, and I was really surprised when I read the label that Brian Wilson had a writing partner. I'm like, who's this Tony Asher guy? He's not a member of the band. And I was surprised because the song sounded so much like a singular person's feelings, like what I assumed to be Brian Wilson's feelings. But Tony Asher explains, "The general tenor of the lyrics was always his, and the actual choice of words was usually mine. I was really just his interpreter." Asher, however, was not needed on two of the album's instrumentals. The atmospheric title track was originally called Run James Run, and Brian had originally written that for a James Bond film.
When you can love again. I had to prove that I could make it alone now, but that's not me.
I'm Waiting for the Day is maybe one of the weaker tracks on the album, a little bit fruity for my taste, but That's Not Me is the only song where the Beach Boys play on. Now, the Beach Boys do play a little bit on this album. Brian plays on about 4 tracks, Carl on 2, and Dennis on 1. Though the overall lyrics to the album were accessible and coming of age, there was one song where the lyrics were problematic. For the song Hang On to Your Ego, Al thought that the lyrics were way too deep and that their fans would never get that, so that was rejected outright. And Mike didn't like the LSD connotations of the lyrics, so the lyrics were changed to I Know There's an Answer. With the lyrics of Hang On to Your Ego was one of the few concessions made to complete this album. So when it was done, Brian and Mike presented it to Capitol, and they met with Carl Engelman, the artisan repertoire guy, and he was very nice. He was a very nice guy, but he's like, well, guys, don't you have a California Girls or I Get Around on here? So as it turns out, they didn't have that, but Capitol released the album as is. And one of the things that Capitol was aware of is this album cost an unprecedented $70,000 to produce. Released in May 1966, Capitol did back this album, contrary to reports that they didn't promote it. And the individual Beach Boys each recorded radio spots for the album, and Capitol ran a full-page ad in Billboard.
Where's your ID? What are your names?
Al. Bruce. Carl.
Mike.
Dennis.
What are you guys?
The Beach Boys.
Now, although this was being promoted, what wasn't being talked about that this was any kind of new sound for the Beach Boys. So essentially, the promotion was what they had always done. So it didn't look any different from a promotional standpoint that this was anything special. But Brian thought, and he created this album as a very special album. And what's weird about this is this advanced sound that they were working on and striving to get, at least Brian was. They had hired a press officer, the Beatles' former press officer, Derek Taylor, and he was hired 2 months before this album was released. And for some reason, there was no PR regarding this new sound. Same thing with Nick Grillo, who was hired as a new manager. So these guys were both hired in March of '66. So strangely ignoring any ideas to update their image in the United States, Derek Taylor set his sights on England and the UK, saying he was hired to take the band to a new plateau, and to that end he invented the tagline, "Brian Wilson is a genius," and a marketing campaign was built around that. Derek Taylor's prestige and Beatle pedigree was crucial to putting this campaign over, and along with Bruce Johnston, in middle of May, Derek Taylor visited London to promote the album Pet Sounds, and a lot of press was invited. There was a listening session with Keith Moon, who got in touch with Lennon and McCartney, and they listened to it, and Lennon and McCartney wanted to hear it again. So the Brian Wilson is a genius tagline and campaign really took hold in England. It wasn't even happening in the United States in May of 1966. Derek Taylor very shrewdly invited several rock journalists to these listening parties, and this helped build the idea that Brian Wilson was a pop genius. And it also built the credibility and the stature of Pet Sounds. Rolling Stone's manager Andrew Loog Oldham was the Beach Boys publisher in the UK, and he supposedly took out a full-page ad in Melody Maker heralding Pet Sounds as the greatest album ever made. But this seems to be one of those other pesky myths because an ad like that has yet to be found. This campaign immediately brought some unintended consequences to the band, who didn't like being called Brian Wilson's puppets, and this really got under Carl's skin in particular. And Carl had said this, "Brian plays the major creative role in the production of our music, but everyone in the group contributes something to the finished product. It's not like an orchestra translating the wishes of a conductor. We all have a part to play in the production of the records."
Wouldn't it be nice if we were older, then we wouldn't have to wait so God only knows what I'd be without you.
By July, this single was released, and Wouldn't It Be Nice hit number 8 in the States, and the B-side hit number 39. Now in the UK, the sides were flipped, and God Only Knows got to number 2, just like its predecessor, Sloop John B. Here are some of the stats on the Pet Sounds album. It was the first album that the Beach Boys had that had 4 top 40 singles. It sold 200,000 copies shortly after its release. It peaked at number 10 on Billboard. It was on the Billboard chart for 10 months, all the way until May of 1967. Sales hit 500,000 by the end of 1966. That makes it a gold record. And it outsold the previous Beach Boys album, The Beach Boys Party, by a wide margin. Now, despite the stats you just heard, writer Will Salmon wrote in a 2021 article on the album that this album flopped hard. Flopped hard. Okay. The Pet Sounds as a failure narrative is very trendy these days, and I'm sure many of you have heard it. And why would somebody say, after hearing these numbers, that this album flopped hard? Well, I guess because most writers do not depend on the numbers. They don't look at the numbers. They take stories that have already been told that are based on loose facts and they enlarge them. And that's why we get a distorted view of the facts. But more importantly, what passes for rock journalism these days relies on the flair for the dramatic and an over-reliance on emotion as opposed to facts. Today, Pet Sounds is considered one of the greatest albums ever made, but there was a time when it did get lost among all the other great albums of the era, and it took several decades for it to reach totem status. There were also theories that Capitol was undermining their own product in Pet Sounds, and one of the things that writers bring up was the fact that Capitol released a greatest hits album 7 weeks after the release of Pet Sounds. Now, this does seem like a very close release, but what they don't realize when they write that, apparently, is that Pet Sounds sold 200,000 copies right out of the gate. So that's not exactly a slow seller. The other thing is that the single, Wouldn't It Be Nice and God Only Knows, was released 2 weeks after the Greatest Hits album. So if they were trying to undermine Pet Sounds, why would they release another single from that same album? And that single actually did very well. Now, Capitol had a habit of crowding releases of their own products. I'm not sure why they did this, but I'll give you an example here. Back in 1963, Little Deuce Coupe was released 3 weeks after Surfer Girl. 3 weeks. In 1966, Revolver was released 6 weeks after the Beatles' Yesterday and Today. So that's even less time in between Pet Sounds and the Greatest Hits. In 1967, Capitol released Smiley Smile 7 weeks after the Greatest Hits Volume 2, and in 1968, Friends was released 6 weeks after Greatest Hits Volume 3. So this was just how Capitol did the releases, and I don't know, I mean, the way I see it, a Greatest Hits buyer might be a little bit of a different buyer than the album-oriented rock that was going on at the time. I'm not saying this was good business, I'm just saying this is how they ran their business. EMI, who controlled the Beach Boys releases in England, released Summer Days and Summer Nights the same month as Pet Sounds, along with 3 other albums in 1966. Why aren't these releases ever brought up? In 1997, Capitol A&R man Carl Engelman, remember him? He's the guy that sat down with Mike Love and Brian Wilson to listen to Pet Sounds. And he said, well, I don't hear our California girls here. Well, he said 31 years later that because the marketing department didn't believe that Pet Sounds was going to do that well, they were probably looking for some additional volume in that quarter. So 31 years later, Engelman is blaming the marketing department. And he's the A&R guy. That's his job to make the releases, not the marketing department's. So you can see how this stuff gets distorted years later by people not wanting to take responsibility. I like to look at some of the contemporary reviews for this album. In the US, Keith Badman refers to Billboard's terse review as published uncharacteristically late, calling it, this is Billboard calling it, an exciting, well-produced LP with 2 superb instrumental cuts and highlighted the strong single potential of Wouldn't It Be Nice. So okay, that may be a short and terse review, but it's certainly positive. It's not negative. According to writer Peter Carlin, he wrote the book Catch a Wave, The Rise and Fall and Redemption of the Beach Boys' Brian Wilson. He states that early reviews for the album in the US range from negative to tentatively positive. Now, I wish I could find some of these early reviews, because I don't find negative reviews. I don't really find a lot of reviews, period. So maybe this album was simply overlooked, but to say there were negative reviews, I think is not being that honest. If you can find any negative reviews or any reviews, pass them my way. I like to read them. Now in the UK, it's often reported that the reviews were glowing and overall positive. So Norman Joplin reported that the LP had been widely praised and subjected to no criticism. He prefaced his review as unbiased and wrote that his only real complaint with the album was the terribly complicated and cluttered arrangements. That sounds like criticism to me. He says, subjected to no criticism. So that to me is a kind of a balanced review, I guess, good and bad. Melody Maker, their survey surveyed Keith Moon, Manfred Mann's Mike DeBow, and Walker Brothers' Scott Walker, and they did not agree that the album was revolutionary. Pete Townsend of The Who opined, quote, "The Beach Boys' new material is too remote and way out. It's written for a feminine audience. Brian Wilson lives in a world of flowers and strawberry-flavored chewing gum. His world has nothing to do with pop. Pop is going out on the road, getting drunk, and meeting the kids." In another issue of Melody Maker, Rolling Stones member Mick Jagger stated that he disliked the songs, but enjoyed the record and its harmonies, while John Lennon said that Wilson was doing some very great things. A reviewer in Disc and Music Echo disagreed, saying this should gain the Beach Boys thousands of new fans. Instrumentally ambitious, vocally over pretty, Pet Sounds has brilliantly tapped the pulse of the musical times. So here we see a bunch of different UK reviews by both pop stars and writers, and it's mixed. It's not overly over the top positive. It's certainly not all positive. In fact, Pete Towns's is downright scathing, I would say. Wilson said in later years that despite the good reviews in the UK, that he felt deeply hurt that the sales weren't nearly as good or what he expected to be in the United States. And he interpreted the poor sales as rejection of his artistry. But here's where this Brian Wilson is a Genius campaign worked against Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, because that campaign was focused only on the UK. So that's where they were talking about him as a pop genius with regard to Pet Sounds. In the United States, that marketing campaign wasn't going on. They just rolled out the same old promotion as they had been always doing with the Beach Boys. And the image of the Beach Boys, despite whatever the promotion they were doing, was still passé if you compared it to, say, the Beatles or a lot of other bands at the time, American bands like the Byrds or the Mamas and Papas or you name it. I mean, the Beach Boys still looked a little bit frumpy next to those bands. So they unfortunately bought into the hype. The marketing worked. It just didn't work the way he wanted it to. So Tony Asher had a different recollection, saying that neither he nor Brian had valued Pet Sounds as a masterpiece at the time. And then Derek Taylor recalled in 1975 that Wilson was unperturbed by the album sales and had been more preoccupied with besting his rivals, namely the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, on an artistic front. And let's face it, there was plenty of rivals out there to go up against. Pet Sounds may have just been lost in a mass of really good music. Despite the reassessments of Pet Sounds as being possibly the greatest album ever made, in its time, the Beach Boys just still don't seem to have the image to go up against some of the rivals. And from an artistic standpoint, there's really nothing that progressive, at least, about the image of this album. Now, Peter Doggett writes about the cover: as a warning of what could happen when music and image parted company, songs of high romanticism, an album cover of stark banality. So I think that he's got a good point there. You know, the slack art direction on this album cover is really unforgivable, considering they hired two guys to handle their image 2 months before this came out. On the back of this album, you've got them in their striped shirts. They're on their tour in Japan. They're wearing samurai outfits. It looks kind of stupid. I mean, compare this to the back of Revolver, when the Beatles are all wearing shades and they're probably stoned out of their minds. You know, I mean, it was a completely different feel. This album, I don't know, spoke to that. Now, this is often called a concept album. I would consider this perhaps more of a concept in production value than anything else. But one concept I do see here is it's kind of a coming-of-age album. But I would consider that the fans that are buying album-oriented rock in '66 or starting to, they had already come of age. I don't know that this would have spoke to them in the same way as when I heard it as a 14-year-old. So that's another thing to consider. One other thing is that this album is not really a rock album. I mean, there's barely any guitar on here. So the whole industry was moving into a heavy rock direction right about when this came out. And this album went in another direction. I think that's what took this album a while to catch on. It took a couple decades to really get its due because it divorced itself from rock. There's an awful lot more I'd like to say about this album that I'll cover in future videos. But until then, keep watching The Beach Boys History, Volume 3. All right, so I've been talking about Pet Sounds. So we're talking about May to October of 1966. That's only 5 months. So at the October point of 1966, all the adulation that Brian Wilson was looking for, he ended up getting it. And that was because of the release of Good Vibrations. Now, Brian started working on Good Vibrations during the Pet Sounds sessions, and Derek called this a pocket symphony. And the reason why this was so different is that Brian started working on this song in sections and like in modules. And these pieces could be moved around anywhere and can be put in any linear sequence depending on what he wanted. And it all seemed to work. And this is how he started to put Good Vibrations together. And there were 6 unique sections to the piece. And as he was working on it, he kept coming back to Pet Sounds to finish that up. And one wonders if Good Vibrations could have been done in time to be included with Pet Sounds, and had that been possibly a lead single from there, what that would have done to Pet Sounds in the United States. As Brian said, I had a lot of unfinished ideas, fragments of music I called feels. Each feel represented a mood or an emotion I'd felt, and I planned to fit them together like a mosaic. Now, Brian started working on Good Vibrations as early as February of 1966, concurrently with Pet Sounds. And what's interesting is that this song, I just mentioned that Pet Sounds wasn't really a rock album, but Good Vibrations certainly was a rock song. So this was a departure, and it was almost very separate in some ways from Pet Sounds. The term Good Vibrations came from the Wilson boys' mother, and that was something that she always said when they were younger. And Tony Asher actually worked on a set of lyrics for this song, but Brian found them unsatisfactory.
She's already working on my brain.
Once Pet Sounds was released, this allowed Brian to work on Good Vibrations almost full-time, at least for a while. And one of the things he added some strange instrumentation like cellos and electro-theremin. After taking off July in the studio, Brian started to work on Good Vibrations simultaneously with tracks for what was going to be the next album. And lyrics were still needed, so Mike Love came up with a poetic verse and a strong hook that leads into the chorus.
I'm picking up good vibrations. She's giving me the excitations.
Mike Love's lyrics, whether he intended them or not, perfectly fit in the flower power movement of the day. And originally this was supposed to be Dennis Wilson on lead vocals, but he had some laryngitis, so Carl got the call to sing lead. Brian then spent several weeks fine-tuning his masterpiece, as Mike Love recalled. I can remember doing 25 to 30 vocal overdubs of the same part. And when I mean the same part, I mean the same section of a record, maybe no more than 2, 3, 4, or 5 seconds long. Like most of Pet Sounds, Good Vibrations was built with a legion of studio musicians, although Brian, Carl, and Dennis all do play on the track. Now, it took over 6 months, 4 different studios in Hollywood, and it cost upwards of $50,000 of studio time to make. But Brian finally finished it. In early September, the unthinkable happened, and all the master tapes for Good Vibrations were stolen, only to be found in Brian's house mysteriously just a few days later. As usual, Capitol Records had a problem with what they felt was psychedelic overtones and promoting LSD in the lyrics of Good Vibrations. And then Brian had to explain that, well, this was not done on LSD, it was done on marijuana. So after he got that cleared up, Capitol said, well, all right, and they released it as is. As Brian explained, I made Good Vibrations on drugs. I used drugs to make that. I learned how to function behind drugs, and it improved my brain. Released in early October of 1966, Good Vibrations sold 230,000 copies in only 4 days, and this made it the band's first million-selling single. And to promote the single, the band made 4 different music videos, kind of in the style of the brand new Monkees TV show. The runaway success of Good Vibrations helped change the ho-hum perception of Pet Sounds from something unhip and maudlin to something hip and psychedelic. And Good Vibrations bridged the direction Brian had started on Pet Sounds, and he finally started to get the adulation he was looking for. Voted #1 band in the world in the NME Readers poll, ahead of the Beatles, and a Danish newspaper awarded Brian Wilson Best Foreign Produced Recording for Good Vibrations. Now, some in rock circles slightly derided Good Vibrations. Again, we have Paul McCartney here. Didn't quite have the emotional thing that Pet Sounds had for me. He did like it, but not as much as Pet Sounds. Pete Townsend said he feared the single would lead to a trend of overproduction. Kind of interesting coming from Pete Townsend. And Phil Spector called it an edit record. McCartney and Townsend's comments were contemporary, while Phil Spector's comment was from the early 2000s. But it's clear to me that the production was hugely groundbreaking, and it was influential to musicians especially. And not only that, but it was hugely popular with fans and with critics. With the success of Good Vibrations, this put the Beach Boys out in front of the Beatles for the very first time, and this prompted them to use Good Vibrations as a template for their next album. But would Brian Wilson live up to the hype? Find out in part 4 of the Beach Boys history here on Pop Goes the 60s.